If you know me, then you know that I have some major beef with modern psychology. And this beef is rooted in my love for psychoanalysis and in my disdain for capitalism. I have always been a huge fan of psychoanalysis, and I absolutely cherish its significance to eliminating bullshit from my life. I remember the first time I read Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, and I totally had my mind blown by this quote. It goes like this: "Life, as we find it, is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments, and impossible tasks. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures. There are perhaps 3 such measures: powerful deflections, which cause us to make light of our misery; substitutive satisfactions, which diminish it; and intoxicating substances, which make us insensible to it." I remember reading this and being overcome by emotion, because I thought about all the pain that I was seeing and how it was a result of these 3 measures. I used to think a lot about what can be done about it, how we can approach our own pain. And I always felt like the solution had something to do with agency. I didn't really know how, but it caused me to think deeply about agency and to try to understand it. And to me, agency was more than just the capacity for an individual or an entity to act independently, make choices, or exert control over actions and environments. Agency, to me, has to be contrasted with structure, which represents the forces that shape or constrain behavior. So, philosophically, agency is debated across different traditions. In psychoanalysis, like with Freud and Lacan, agency is complicated by the unconscious. So, this suggests that people are driven by forces that are beyond their own awareness. In structuralist thought and post-structuralist thought, like with Deleuze and Guattari, agency is seen as like entangled with power, discourse, and desire. And this often questions the idea of a sovereign subject. All of these approaches and thoughts really help me understand agency and think about what is necessary to overcome structure and to embrace agency. But nobody made it as clear to me as Max Stirner. Because in Stirner's egoism, agency is completely stripped down to its naked body. And one thing I learned from Stirner is that this process has to be completely divorced from structural meaning. I mean, the entire point of egoism is to say that structure is nothing but a spook, and that it isn't some immovable force pressing down on me from above. It's about knowing or understanding that it exists only insofar as I recognize it, obey it, or let it shape my sense of self. And this is so important. So agency then is about disowning structure entirely and refusing to let it define my actions, my thoughts, and my desires. My entire internal revolution reached from psychoanalysis with Freud, from Lacan, to Deleuze and Guattari, and then to Stirner. And, well, modern psychology feels like a complete betrayal of my entire journey. It takes everything that's valid about psychoanalysis, so its depth, its confrontation with the unconscious, its refusal to reduce human suffering to a dysfunction, and it flattens it into a managerial tool for making people more functional within the existing system. It doesn't ask why we suffer, it asks how we can become more resilient, more productive, more adaptable to the very structures that produce our misery in the first place. So where psychoanalysis saw neurosis as a symptom of something deeper, like an existential crisis or a conflict with desire, or even a rebellion against repression, modern psychology sees it as a bug to be fixed, or like a malfunction in need of correction. And this is where my beef with capitalism comes in. Modern psychology's endless emphasis on cognitive distortions, behavioral interventions, and self-optimization has fully aligned itself with neoliberal self-management. It's no longer about interrogating the contradictions of our existence. It's about learning to cope with them effectively without making too much noise to keep the machine running. And I don't know, fuck the machine. So before I have a stroke from this topic, let's actually look at it. Let's look at the history. Let's look at what it means. Let's look at what it's all about. And specifically, let's look at a case study of one of modern psychology's favorite tools for making people functional in capitalism: cognitive behavioral therapy. So to do so, let's go a little bit back in time and trace the evolution of psychological practice and thought. Okay, so before psychoanalysis, psychology was largely dominated by philosophy and physiology, and maybe even early experimental psychology, with inquiries into the mind being mostly speculative or neurological rather than therapeutic. Ancient and early modern thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Locke debated the nature of consciousness and often framed it in dualistic or empiricist terms. By the 18th and 19th centuries, associationism, like with Hume and Mill, viewed thought as a chain of learned experiences, while physiological psychology, like with Müller and Helmholtz, linked mental processes to the nervous system. Early psychiatry shifted mental illness treatment from demonology to medical approaches, but it remained largely institutional. Wilhelm Wundt's structuralism attempted to break consciousness into elemental parts through introspection, and William James's functionalism emphasized adaptation and survival. At the same time, phenomenologists like Husserl, for example, examined subjective experience, and neurologists like Charcot and Janet studied hysteria and ended up showing that unconscious forces influence behavior, which kind of directly paved the way for Freud. So then, psychoanalysis was the big disruption from this idea that humans can be viewed through any kind of rationalist paradigm by asserting that unconscious drives and repression and internal conflicts actually shape human behavior. So then in the late 19th and early 20th century, Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis by introducing concepts like the unconscious, repression, and the role of childhood experiences in shaping personality. Then in the 1920s until the 1950s, there was a change which led to a heightened focus on what is called behaviorism, which was mostly popular in America. And this movement was led by John B. Watson and later also Skinner. This also marked a shift to psychology becoming increasingly empirical and mechanistic, and it kind of aligned itself with positivist science. In the 1950s until the 1970s, there was also a shift that was called the cognitive revolution. So, because behaviorism faced criticism for ignoring mental processes, many psychologists called for this cognitive revolution, which basically integrated insights from information theory, linguistics, and actually even early AI research. So figures like Jean Piaget and Noam Chomsky and Ulrich Neisser emphasized that mental functions like thoughts, memory, and perception can actually be scientifically studied. And while this represents a shift from strict behaviorism, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, cognition is still largely framed in functionalist terms, which reduces the mind to an information processing system. Then in the 1980s, having started a few decades earlier, there was a clear decline of psychoanalysis in academia. And this was especially in the US, which ended up having a giant impact on the entire world. So after having successfully pushed almost all psychoanalytic work out of academia and even public knowledge, like think about what happened to Wilhelm Reich in America and how to this day everyone makes fun of Freud and is sure that he's discredited somehow even though they know nothing about his work. Anyways, there was one last glimmer of hope, which was Jacques Lacan. But although his work was embraced with open arms by philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and so forth, where it's relevant to this day, psychology actually rejected the living fuck out of it. And what it ended up with, despite Lacan's massive efforts, was short-term, symptom-focused therapies that made sure we could trick our brains to go back to work. And this marked the rise of a new therapeutic model called cognitive behavioral therapy, which blends the worst behaviorism with the worst of cognitive restructuring techniques. Okay, so now we have something like biological reductionism, which treats mental disorders as neurochemical imbalances, which paved the way to the absolute stunning industry of psychopharmaceuticals and CBT treatment, influenced largely by neoliberalism and its favorite pastime, self-help and improvement. And now we got Gen Z and whatever the new one's called scrolling TikTok for the newest trauma pathology definition that explains their pain, their actual pain. And this discourse, along with positive psychology and mindfulness trends, then further depoliticizes suffering, which ultimately makes people believe that their distress is personal and can be approached with agency rather than looking at the actual structural issues. And this, to me, is deeply problematic because it completely ignores that agency is deeply influenced by structure. So let's use the example of cognitive behavioral therapy to show this. What even is cognitive behavioral therapy? Like, how does it work? Well, at its core, CBT operates on the principle that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected, and that by identifying and challenging distorted thinking patterns, individuals can alter their emotional responses and behaviors. In practice, CBT encourages individuals in therapy to examine their cognitive distortions. So this means that thoughts are represented as unrealistic, overly negative, or irrational most of the time, and they are then told to replace them with more balanced and realistic perspective. This kind of therapy relies heavily on structured exercises, self-monitoring, and goal setting, and it really aims to teach individuals how to quote-unquote correct their thoughts in order to alleviate emotional distress and so-called maladaptive behaviors. But CBT's emphasis on the individual's cognitive restructuring and self-regulation comes with actually pretty profound implications because it strips the context of social, economic, and political influences from the equation completely. In this way, CBT is not a tool for transformation, but a tool for adaptation. It's a method of encouraging individuals to become more functional within the structures that actually shape their suffering. And this aligns perfectly with neoliberal ideals, obviously, because it prioritizes personal responsibility, self-management, and productivity over systemic critique. So the very concept of cognitive distortion, for instance, is predicated on the notion that there is a right way to think, a norm to conform to. So what is this if not a call for capitalist efficiency and conformity? When we're told that our emotional suffering is just a result of faulty thinking, we're essentially being told to fix ourselves in order to be better and to fit into an inherently flawed system, rather than questioning the system or exploring the deeper roots of our pain. CBT also doesn't interrogate the underlying structures that shape our thoughts and behaviors. It doesn't ask why we feel anxious, depressed, or alienated in the first place, nor does it address the social conditions, power dynamics, and historical contexts that might be contributing to this distress. Instead, it just tells us to reframe our experiences and to focus on the present and to adopt coping strategies to manage our mental health. And in this way, CBT mirrors the managerial logic of capitalism as it emphasizes resilience, adaptability, and efficiency at the expense of critical self-reflection or any notion of societal change that could come with that. And hear me out. I'm not saying this approach can't be helpful for certain individuals in certain day-to-day situations managing day-to-day distress. I am sure it is. But overall, it fails to address the deeper existential and structural issues that often lie at the root of human suffering. So where psychoanalysis would have probably invited a deep and honest exploration of the unconscious forces that drive human behavior and wouldn't have shied away from the messy, uncomfortable truths, CBT seeks to tame and manage suffering, and this is a problem because suffering is a vital part of our subjectivity, one that, when understood, can reveal the massive influence of structure on our agency rather than pretending that agency is something we all have. So let me say this in Stirner's terms, because this is what's coming up next. We have to eliminate the spooks before we can claim ownness, and the focus on managing symptoms, even if it's just temporary or to get through the day, can affect our already confused mind in a way that makes us forget that we are being mistreated, oppressed, limited, made small and needy, and dependent on the structural forces that keep us away from our agency. So what is the alternative? Let's look at it again. cognitive behavioral therapy presents itself as an evidence-based, pragmatic approach to mental suffering, but from a Stirnerian, Psychoanalytic, and Deleuzo-Guattarian perspective, which all kind of align to make the point that I'm trying to make here, it is little more than a technology of normalization. So let's look at how it colonizes the mind and what can be done about it. Stirner's critique of spooks, which you're going to just have to look up if you're new here because I'm not going to recap it for the 68,000th time, applies directly to CBT's foundational assumption, which is that the self has to conform to an external standard of rationality and well-being. So CBT operates on the premise that distorted thoughts lead to suffering, and thus they must be corrected. But let me ask you this. Who the hell defines distortion? The entire CBT framework assumes that irrational beliefs, quote unquote irrational, like catastrophic thinking, excessive guilt, existential dread, whatever, are malfunctions to be debugged. So then CBT functions as a moral economy of the psyche, in which thoughts and emotions have to be audited and replaced with more functional ones. So the CBT patient learns that their suffering is not a response to material conditions or social alienation or structural oppression, but actually a personal cognitive failure. And the remedy is a self-restructuring project aimed at making the subjective more adaptive, more resilient, more functional, and therefore more useful to the system. This is also shown by psychoanalysis because Freud and Lacan saw symptoms as compromises between unconscious desire and social reality, but CBT sees them as errors to be eliminated. The fundamental psychoanalytic critique of CBT would be that it treats the symptom as noise rather than a message. And that's exactly what it is. It's a message. CBT asks, how can we change your thoughts to make you feel better? But psychoanalysis asks, what does your suffering say about you and therefore about the world around you? So take, for example, a patient who believes they are worthless. I'm sure there's lots of them. CBT will encourage them to challenge this belief by finding evidence of their worth. A psychoanalytic approach, on the other hand, would explore what unconscious investments the patient has in their own worthlessness. So it would look at things like guilt, or an unresolved Oedipal conflict, or masochistic attachment to failure, whatever. So basically, psychoanalysis wouldn't view this and any other distress as a glitch in rational cognition, but as an expression of unconscious desire and repression. Then another way to look at this would be the work of Deleuze and Guattari. So for Deleuze and Guattari, the schizophrenic tendencies of desire, or in other words, its ability to deterritorialize and to overflow and disrupt, are always kind of under siege by mechanisms of control. CBT can be understood as precisely this kind of reterritorialization, which is like an attempt to bring unruly psychic flows back into a rigid structure of meaning and function. So CBT assumes that thoughts must be structured in a linear, organized, and productive manner, but Deleuze and Guattari show us a completely different picture where thought is actually rhizomatic, which means that it's constantly breaking away from imposed structures. The unconscious is not a logical machine of faulty beliefs, but a desiring machine, which is something that produces intensities, ruptures, and new becomings. So CBT, in its effort to make thoughts rational and productive, actually functions as a policing mechanism, which ends up shutting down deterritorialized flows, and it redirects them towards stability and function. This means that CBT is an Oedipalizing machine, because it assumes that distress is rooted in thinking errors, quote unquote, rather than the restrictive familial and social structures that discipline desire. So much like the Oedipal model, which forces the subject into a fixed identity within the family structure, CBT forces thought into a narrow cognitive frame where only certain thoughts are permissible and others have to be eliminated. It also functions as a capitalist machine. So In Anti-Oedipus, Deleuzo-Guattari describe capitalism as a system that constantly captures and repurposes desire to fit its logic of production. CBT is a prime example of this process because instead of seeing mental distress as a response to exhaustion, alienation, or systemic oppression, CBT individualizes suffering and it reduces it to a set of dysfunctional cognitions that the subject has to fix. So the goal is not freedom, but productivity, or in other words, to return the worker to a functional state so they can continue participating in the system. And while these frameworks like psychoanalysis and the work of Deleuzo-Guattari offer really great ways of understanding these mechanisms behind all of this, Stirner actually offers a really, really helpful alternative. If CBT seeks to domesticate the subject, a Stirnerian, Deleuzo-Guattarian approach would embrace the wildness of thought, right? So instead of correcting distortions, the egoist would ask questions like, what if my so-called irrational thoughts are expressions of my radical autonomy? What if my catastrophizing is my mind's way of asserting its power to break from imposed optimism? What if my intrusive thoughts are a refusal of imposed rationality? So rather than to submit to the cognitive policing of CBT or modern psychology in general, the egoist owns their own thoughts. And it doesn't matter how chaotic, contradictory, or absurd they are. And with the help of Deleuzo-Guattari, we can push this even further. So instead of organizing thought into a tidy, rational grid, why not just let it proliferate, mutate, and escape? Why not create new ways of thinking, new lines of flight, or new becomings, in their words? So CBT demands functionality. The egoist exclaims ownness, which means to think as they wish, suffer as they wish, and refuse the spooks of normativity altogether. Where CBT seeks to bring thoughts under control, a Stirnerian Deleuzo-Guattarian alternative actually affirms the madness of desire, the anarchy of thought, and the uniqueness of the self beyond the reach of therapy's moralizing hand. And how this would look in practice is unique to the person doing it. But the one thing it most certainly takes is to understand that agency is deeply guided by structural influences, something that Stirner's philosophy is literally all about. Agency is nothing without that understanding. And unfortunately, that is exactly what the propagators of CBT want us to believe. That agency comes before structure, which is fucking nonsense, and ultimately leads to a trap which ensures the functionality of the system that not only fucks us over, but also everyone else around us. So while it may be useful in a particular moment to make it through a rough day, please, 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 remember what it actually means. Thank you guys for your interest in this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to my people on Patreon and YouTube who chose this topic, and thank you for all your support here on YouTube, on Patreon, and on Substack. I just want to do a little tiny bit of promo for the upcoming weekly podcast. I think it's going to be so much fun. We're going to talk about everyday spooks, spooky weekly subjects, new developments of our project, and so much more. So please tune in and give it a chance. The first episode will be published on Sunday, March 2nd, 8 p.m. Central European Time, and I am so very excited for it. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Substack, and Patreon under Recurring Paradox, and the podcast is called The Spookcast. So, see you there.